The commander's intent, go help Americans, was crystal clear as far as I was concerned. It set the stage for me very clearly that this situation was not a normal situation. This is not normal circumstances. And they trust my judgment to go up there and figure out where I could be value added.
Welcome to the Air Force Doctrine Podcast. My name is Nicholas Underwood. On this episode, I sit down with retired Lieutenant General Brad Webb and discuss his experience as an MH-53 pilot and mission commander in responding to the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. As we discuss, General Webb relates his experience to the principles of mission command and the 5 C's of a mission command culture as detailed in the newly released AFDP 1-1 Mission Command, available at doctrine.af.mil. Please join us. Lieutenant General retired Marshal Brad Webb's service spans 38 years in the Air Force. During his career, he served as the commander of Air Education and Training Command and Air Force Special Operations Command. He has commanded in squadron, group, wing, numbered Air Force, and NATO positions. He is also a command pilot with more than 3,700 flying hours, including 117 combat hours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Bosnia. Leading up to the events on September 11, 2001, then Lieutenant Colonel Webb was serving as the 20th Special Operations Squadron's operations officer, participating in an exercise supporting joint partners at Fort Bragg. Awakening to the news of the attacks, Lieutenant Colonel Webb was relayed the simple commander's intent of, "Go help Americans." General Webb and his crew's embodiment of the 5 C's of a mission command culture and ability to operate under the principles of mission command in response to 9/11 is an inspiring and instructional case study for all airmen seeking to better understand the future of Air Force leadership and command and control. General Webb, thank you so much for being here. Just for a background for our audience, when we were writing AFDP 1-1 Mission Command, we ran across your story and Daryl Whitcomb's On a Steel Horse I Ride, but the vignette didn't really get into details, so I was hoping that we could bring you on today and have you tell the full story and maybe dive into some Mission Command. So thanks again for being here, and if you want to tell the story, we'd be super happy to hear it.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure and honored to be asked. That mission set, so to speak, just kind of happened because of circumstances. I was the director of operations for the 20th Special Operations Squadron at the time. We were deployed in several locations on exercises. I had several aircraft in Asheville, North Carolina, doing mountain training, and then the rest of the deployment was in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, doing support with special operations up there. So really how this all came about was we had been night flying that week. I had turned on the TV as most folks do. And, when I had woken up that morning, it was right after the first aircraft had hit one of the World Trade Center buildings. And as I was watching, the second one hit, which then, of course, I, like everyone else in America, knew that wasn't sure. There's no way that was an accident. And so I always carried my secure phone with me. I plugged it in and connected to the wing right away. And also they looped in the AFSOC, the MAGCOM headquarters. And really the directive was get everybody on base as soon as you can. In those days, Pope Air Force Base sits inside of Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg was an open base or an open post, and they knew that they were going to lock down. So we were just waking everybody up and pack up and let's go get inside, which is what we did. And then we showed up at the JSOC compound, and I just kind of walked into their JOC and checked back in with AFSOC. It was relayed to me what our tasking was going to be, and it was quoted as directly from General Fogelsong, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the time. Said, "Go help Americans." In other words, take your 5 ship of aircraft and head up to the ground zero environments, which of course in this case meant Guar Air Force Base and to check in with 21st Air Force. So that happened probably within a couple of hours of the incident. Let's just say noonish. I don't remember exactly. And the rest of the day was taken up with coordinating flight clearance from the FAA. You can appreciate the airspace all over America was shut down for obvious reasons, and it took us that long to get clearance. So we left probably in the early to mid evening from Fort Bragg and made our way up to McGuire.
The part that really stands out to me is that really clear commander's intent, go help Americans.
Yeah, the directive or the commander's intent, go help Americans, was crystal clear as far as I was concerned. It set the stage for me very clearly that this situation was not a normal situation. This is not normal circumstances. And they trust my judgment to go up there and figure out where I could be value added.
Did you, as you kind of get that commander's intent, You got your crews and you have a set of tools. Obviously, Pablo's trained to a variety of mission sets. As you're going up there, you don't have a whole lot of information. And so what do you kind of imagine at this point you're going to go up and do, or you just waiting to find out?
Well, we assumed, and it was probably relayed something the sort that this was a rescue and recovery type of operation. And of course, at the time, you know how information rolls. There was no earthly inkling of how many people might have survived a collapse of the structures. Of course, that had happened by then. And we thought that we would be in some kind of rescue mode to some degree, but weren't sure. And so really our focus was let's get up there. Let's sort out what's happening when we get on the ground and make a plan. And so really that was during the day. But in the back of my mind, I figured it would be something rescue and recovery type of oriented.
Interesting. And so when you do arrive at McGuire, you're getting there and you're expecting kind of get a laid out plan of how you're going to be employed. But what was the reception actually like?
Honestly, this was Noble Eagle from that basis perspective was all about tanker support for the fighter cap. It was also the reception base for all the logistics that were flowing into the area, not just military, but FEMA and any of the FBI, anybody that was coming in was kind of using that. So they had their arms full. They really didn't have a good feel for usage of the Pavo helicopters. They weren't all that familiar with them, and that's certainly understandable. So really nothing for me to do is what I got out of the early morning stand-up. So really, I oriented on one of the briefers was a guy that was a fire chief by trade out of Dayton, Ohio. And when he's federalized, he comes under the FEMA rubric as an urban search and rescue task force specialist, and specifically on logistics. And he was briefing, of course, from his perspective, and I locked in on him as, hey, this guy is going to need help. And so I just went up and introduced myself and said, hey, I'm Brad Webb. I got 5 big MH-53 helicopters here. We're here to support you. What do you need? And that, of course, that begat a whole series of what can you do, which was, well, the answer was, what do you need us to do? When can you go? When do you need us to go? And this kind of back and forth, and he kind of oriented on what I was doing, and he asked if I could, one of the urban search and rescue teams actually needed to be down at the Pentagon for support down there, and he didn't have a way to get them there. And he said, can you get these guys down there? Absolutely. So we launched and took their team down there. That was the first mission we did. And from there, I think he gleaned that, Webb's kind of serious. So we started looking for, employment there at ground zero.
Want to catch you real quick on something I think that's very important to the Mission Command, the mindset of it. You're in a jock that don't really have an exact use for you defined. And so at this point, you're not being given a tasking, but in your mind, you're going, I'm here, I'm supposed to go help Americans. And so you find this non-DOD agency and say, these guys need help. I know it's a difficult thing to describe that mindset, but what is your drive as you're there and you're going, okay, they have nothing for me, that kind of forces you to go, okay, I have a tasking, I need to make this happen?
Well, probably a couple things. And this isn't unique to me. I think most Americans that were watching events unfold after 9/11 probably felt the same way, which was, I want to do something. And certainly we felt that way. And being that close to it, from McGuire Air Force Base to Manhattan Island in a helicopter is maybe a half an hour away. I'm not sure. So in other words, we were right on top of the situation. We wanted to do something. And clearly there was a beehive of activity that was forming. So how do we fit in was really the mindset. I certainly grew up in an environment where that was the norm. I think that it helps being in a joint, growing up in a joint environment with Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force kind of presence. And in later years, of course, it was interagency for sure. That mindset helps because you're going to inevitably end up in situations, one will these days, where folks around you, maybe even decision makers around you, aren't going to know exactly what you bring to the table. So you have to have some level of assertiveness. I think it helps to have reps that way, but it's definitely, I think, in the spirit of mission command and mission type orders, you need to not be a wallflower. Get out there and say, here's what I can do. And of course, nothing wrong with someone saying, yeah, thanks, we got nothing for you. But in this case, you could tell that it was going to be a situation that you could see they're going to need helicopters. There's no doubt about it. It was just a matter of really, it wasn't that hard finding, this urban search and rescue task force guy and saying, you look like you could use some help. And how's 5 helicopters sound?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you said it very well. The definition of mission command is evolved, and then One TAC 1 will see that it has now been defined as a philosophy. The idea that there's an embodiment of these big elements of mission command, the principles as we call it, and these attributes, what we call the 5 C's in the document, that changes the way in which we approach problems and approach operations. Instead of this is what I do, just as you said to your FEMA contact, is what do you need me to do? I have tools and skills, and I will apply them to your situation.
In the early days of our support, I established with him, what can you do? What do you need me to do? Kind of give and take. But by giving the mission orders of go help Americans, that established crystal clear in my head that this wasn't situation normal. This wasn't business as usual. We needed to use our noodle to sort it out. I honestly, and I don't mean this in any way disparaging, because this guy's a really good friend of mine, but I don't think he'd been empowered that way. His FEMA construct, his was to go out there and exercise the process and do defense support to civil authorities the way you've been trained, which of course I was aware of defense support to civilian authorities, given some experience that I had respective of more counterterrorism related stuff. Humanitarian relief operations, or whatever you want to call this situation, I didn't really have any experience. What I did have was the knowledge that this isn't business as usual, and we need to figure it out. We need to make it happen. And that was a little bit of a rub for him for several days, because I don't believe he was that empowered. In fact, he was catching quite a bit of grief for being kind of way out on the limb, until he got a word back from the FEMA director several days into it that, as I think people were trying to throw him under the bus at this, hey, we got this wild card out there at McGuire. And he said, actually, I think all of y'all need to be behaving like him, because he's out there getting a lot of good stuff done. And when he got relayed that message that the FEMA director had his back, it was literally a light switch. And we were rocking all the more with, let's figure out how we get it done. No longer was he concerned with who's paying for the gas bill and, the stuff that's important. I mean, I'm not saying that's not nothing, but I had even checked in with AFSOC on, hey, he's concerned with who's paying for gas. And they said, well, Webb, you're on an Air Force base. You're flying log teat training time on your code and your forms, and we'll figure it out later. It wasn't, my leadership was not concerned about it, and I wasn't going to be concerned about it. We'll keep track of it, and we'll sort it out at the end of the day.
And so I want to make sure I understand that. So it sounds like he's operating under more of a detailed directive, a very go out and make sure this process works with getting gas, and the bureaucracy is set and works this particular way. And it seems that to be his goal. And yours is a very strategic in-state, go help Americans. And so there's creating some friction there till eventually he's empowered by his commander. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's right. Yeah. This person was very used to responding to floods, to hurricanes, to earthquakes, and what have you, and was very steeped in the process of how the process works. I wasn't. Really. I mean, I understood that there's some methodology that employed, but it was a secondary priority to me. Priority one was what my leadership chain had said was figure out how to plug in and go help Americans. I mean, go help Americans. That's it.
So I know from the story that you get tagged up with the FEMA director and you get your crews down onto the scene. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about it, because you found a rather unique landing place to get into the scene, and then maybe describe, you go from kind of an area of where there's not a whole lot of information, and then what does that change when you actually get real close to the tactical edge there? Obviously,
we knew we were aiming to get down to ground zero. And of course, that's Manhattan Island. It's a very tight spaces. The Fayetteville helicopter is a pretty big helicopter. And the first, kind of obstacle is, where are we going? Where are we going to land? It just so happened that guys that were on the deployment with me. Some of them had been part of the 1st Helicopter Squadron, which are Huey VIP flying helicopters. That part of their job was to fly routes in New York City. And they were aware of this museum piece in the Hudson River called the USS Intrepid. They landed their Hueys there, kind of as part of their routine. And so we did some quick research and, got the phone number to the museum curator or the CEO, who was a retired Marine Lieutenant General. And I called him and let him know who I was and what I wanted to do. And he said, "Yep, absolutely. When you coming?" And I said, "I can be there in a half hour." He goes, "Give me an hour and a half. I got to clear some stuff out of the way, meaning museum pieces on the deck." And so we showed up there and landed. From there, the situation learned to skyrocket because unbeknownst to me, the Intrepid, along with, I think, the Javits Center in downtown Manhattan, were kind of hubs of where all the responding, first responders and other responders were coalescing. One of them was certainly on the Intrepid. And so when I landed and showed up and said, "Hey, got a few helicopters here," what was left of the Port Authority, the New York City Police Department, the New York City Fire Department, New York City Emergency Management Team, FBI, and who knows what else. Absolutely, we need someone that can get us an aerial view because we're still grappling with, this is the next day, obviously. We don't know where all the fires are. We don't know where possible routes into the area might be. We don't know if there's confined spaces that might have the possibility of having survivors. This is very early, obviously, in the operation, and the helicopters that they had weren't able to fly to at least where they needed to view from because of all the suspended concrete and everything, and it was basically dust clouds that were still in the air. And the Pavlo could, because it had an engine air particle separator system called EAPS that really kind of filters out the impediments in the air. And I was confident that we could fly in that, which we could. We were obviously diligent in checking engines, stuff like that. But so that's what we did. Our first missions were to just take a big team of all those folks that I mentioned, agency-wise, and let them get their first kind of overhead awareness. The helicopter, as in those days, had a VHS tape deck in it. Nowadays it would be CD or thumb drive or what have you. And we could record out of the FLIR ball, the forward-looking infrared balls, and which we did. Flight engineer kind of can steer it around and record where they wanted to record. That worked okay, but you got the guys in the back saying, "Hey, can we get a view of such and such a building?" Which of course we don't know one building from the others. We're not, obviously. This is my first time I'd ever seen New York City. And so they're trying to say, "Hey, can you look at World Trade Center number 7?" And we're like, "Which one's that?" We don't. But so anyway, we made a tape for them and landed, and that proved very useful to those guys there that had established their command center on the Intrepid.
I want to pull out some of the environmental piece to really connect this. Obviously, this kind of response, humanitarian civil response here, is a little different than combat operations, but there are something that I think is very useful to pull out in terms of understanding the information flow of the environment. We talk a lot about future operations and contested, degraded environments where comms are down. But we also talk about ops tempo being much higher than we ever have before. And I don't think there's ever a connection to how the flow of information slows down when ops tempo goes up. And I think that's a great example of you got there and you were suddenly able to get a lot more information being right there at the edge than you could at the jock. And it wasn't because of degraded communications. It was just because of the pace at which the operations were happening. And perhaps there's a good parallel to what we look at now and in the future in combat.
Yeah, absolutely. The one piece I think would be germane to ensure that we fit in here, because I actually think that role was our key role. It was early on. They didn't have good real awareness at all. Our guys, when we got home from that mission that night, unbeknownst to me, and I think that's important, got together, one of my planners, captain planners, who was understanding what was happening around us and how we had contributed that day, got together with our maintainers and some of the security forces folk from McGuire. And the security forces had this camera. I suppose it's an infrared camera that can see through concrete. In other words, they can see heat sources. And so the guys overnight devised a scheme in which they mounted this camera to the what we call the hellhole, which is really the cargo hook compartment in the 53. The Pavlos didn't generally carry the cargo hook because it's an external load kind of capacity. We don't usually use it that way. So it's just an open space. And they mounted that camera in that space, connected it up to the recording system. And when I woke up the next morning and got ready for the day's missions, it was already functional and ready to go. That ended up being a boon because when we took the planes up that day and we had these cameras on board, now the guys in the back, the emergency responders, et cetera, could steer it had a little remote thing. You could steer the camera. They could record on and off the way they wanted to. There wasn't this kind of gossip train relay to the flight engineer or the pilot on what they wanted. We just needed to hold it in the general area. They could move the camera where they wanted to see and record. And I think that was the single biggest contribution that we had. I'm pretty proud of that because that was not Webb directed at all. That was maintenance supervisors, captain planners, security forces who didn't work for us at all, that understood what the mission intent was and moved out. Now, of course, I did due diligence on talking with them, but it was a sight to behold, and I think it was the single biggest contribution to our 5 days or week worth of support up there.
The story you just told is definitively disciplined initiative being exercised by your crews. So you woke up and you went out there and you saw this camera had been installed, and you're very comfortable with this. And what makes you comfortable with this as you talk to your maintainers and the guys that installed this aircraft?
Well, this wasn't a wild hair from a captain with a good idea that went out and did it without any kind of appropriate supervision. I consider the maintenance soups on the line. They were brought in fully, and they said, "Oh yeah, we can do this," and helped them. I mean, they did it. The captain just asked them, "Hey, would this be possible?" It passed the smell test to me. The maintenance guys were perfectly comfortable with it. The security forces were thrilled to be able to contribute, just like, as I was describing earlier. Everybody just wanted to do something. If it's a piece of kit that we have that can help out, absolutely. So is it secure in there? Does it work? Is it compatible with our recording system? Yes, sir. It's all good. Then let's go.
That's interesting. We talk about mutual trust and shared understanding frequently as these like blocks and these very intentional elements, but a lot of that comes very organically. Your crews are demonstrating, the captain that pursues this is demonstrating a very shared understanding of what we're here, what we're trying to do, and pursuing that out. I think a lot of times we look at these very pointedly, but the principles themselves all flow together to make each other work. So one of the reasons that we moved to a more detailed directive within our policies is generally advertised as reducing risk, whether it's strategic risk, tactical risk, risk to personnel. There's a lot of different reasons. Yet one of the principles says to accept prudent risk. And so you kind of, as we parallel the two mindsets here between you and the FEMA contact, he's trying to reduce risk by maintaining this process of bureaucracy, and it's what has been told to do. But you're over on a much larger commander's intent. And traditional thinking would think that you're having to accept a lot of risk to do this. But I don't think that's the case. There's definitely a different mindset. So how are you kind of framing risk to your crews in terms of their left and right bounds?
Well, to the crews, it was more about operational employment risk, which really, honestly, there wasn't that much risk. Things that we were being asked to do, carry logistics missions or hover over ground zero, albeit maybe in a strange environment with respect to suspended dust or granite or what have you, making sure that we didn't make a bad situation worse really was the kind of the guidance I gave them, because we didn't know the stability of the other buildings that hadn't fallen yet, that clearly it had damage, and we didn't want to obviously hurt people that were working the rubble pile or anything like that. But operationally, that was where they were. Where I think what I kind of kept between me and FEMA guys is really risk, if you want to call it that, on an authorities or an administrative side. And I did check in with AFSOC periodically, and There was I certainly got no blame. Hey, this is what they're concerned with. And they're like, you could feel the shoulder shrug over the phone. Hey, Brad. Yeah. So I felt vindicated at every turn that we're doing the right thing. We may not be doing things absolutely 100% right. It's nothing that can't be sorted out afterwards.
I want to transition here to talk a little bit about the crews. We kind of pulled apart Mission Command as a mindset, and we talked about these elements that have to be in place in order to go out and execute what you and your crews did admirably. I think the best way to ask this is to think about this situation and imagine your crews having to go knowing they were going to go do this. And if you knew you were going to operate this with this broad intent all the time in the future, would that change the way in which you trained your crews?
I think that we were in an advantageous position being special operations crews that have arguably more opportunity to exercise judgment in conditions of ambiguity. And I'm not saying it was 100% because it's not that way, lock, stock, and barrel inside of AFSOC or inside of SOCOM or anything else. But I believe that there is some degree that's very, very useful. You can't just exercise that when the balloon goes up. You need to have trained with ambiguity, trained with uncertainty. Leaders need to obviously be competent and exercise good oversight, but you have to allow for it outside the box thinking to take root, because at the end of the day, training is about honing skills, but the exact skill that you're exercising may be used in a combat environment or in an uncertain environment, or it might be something that's very akin, but you need to apply it in a different way. That is, I think, a fundamental tenet of what we're trying to get after here.
So I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to really talk about empowerment in general. So empowerment of airmen is definitely at the core of Mission Command, but empowerment takes initiative. It's difficult. There's a feeling of commanders, feeling of risk there. There's a confusion that sometimes happens between enthusiasm and capability. What do we need from our airmen? What do we need for our commanders to really empower our force?
Really important question. I think this is really one of the items that I really focused my last command tour at the ETC on. As a leader empowers, there is a certain at least one prerequisite that you have to pay attention to, and that is the acknowledgement of competence. Because we have a phrase for if everybody's empowered and we're all running around and being empowered airmen, that's called Lord of the Flies. There has to be at some level someone that acknowledges or that labels a person or a team or whatever. They have competency. They are empowered to move out. I think that's very important. And I kind of alluded to this a second ago, but the key ingredients, the human clay that the United States Air Force has is the quality of our people. And I know from where I speak, because I've done tours in other nations. I've been involved in, I was a commander in NATO. There are countries in our alliance that hold American military fighters as the standard. And why is that? Because of our NCO Corps, specifically our professionalized NCO Corps. There are nations inside NATO that have conscripts and they have officers, and they are looking to jumpstart their kind of professionalized NCO Corps by reflagging some of their officers into senior NCO ranks because of the example of the U.S. Without building this whole watch of how we are different than China, let me suffice to say that the Chinese, at the end of the day, while they don't have much bureaucracy and they can line up their priorities in quick manner, they don't fundamentally trust their people. And our asymmetric advantage is that we do. And if we've established competency and empower our folk, man, you want to talk about a force multiplier. And so when we talk about how do we exercise, mission command and what does it mean, we need to always keep this in the forefront. Yes, it's for a great powers competition, but I would hold the United States Air Force's response in COVID as a great example. That's not combat, but we were faced with something that was clearly an unusual situation. This wasn't business as usual. As General Goldfein said, this is business as required. And I remember early on in COVID, I sent a note to all echelons of my command, parroting what General Goldfein had just said. This isn't business as usual. This is business required. and I've got your back. We still have a mission to do. The readiness of the United States Air Force will literally fall off a cliff if we don't continue to train. So how are we going to do it? And I don't know the answer. You guys do. But we got to figure out what we can do. I know it's not going to be everything that we've done prior to COVID, but I got some responses back. Hey, sir, I've never commanded in a pandemic before. Yeah, neither have I. I mean, the last one was 1918 or whatever. And so, we just need to figure it out. It didn't take long. I'm telling you, once people saw that, hey, we're serious about, this way of doing basic military training is not going to be like we did it last week, or pilot training or tech training, or, that happened to be my portfolio. And we moved out with enthusiasm. And it wasn't without some, in the early days, we had scared people. It took some direct, eyeball to eyeball engagement with folks to go, hey, this is what I need you to do. What do you need from me? Well, sir, I want to live in billeting because I don't want to go home to my family right now because I might. Okay, so we got them rooms in billeting. We built a tent city right there in the middle of basic military training, so we could say, I asked them, what do you need? Make sure they got it. And then they moved out in tall order. That's one example. It's not a combat example. It's not the 9/11 response, but it's these type of things that I think are really important. People that came out of this environment proved beyond the shadow of a doubt, they can think outside the box, and they can be very successful in an empowered situation.
As we sat down at the LeMay Center here to draft this document, one of the early revelations as we're looking at the literature on Mission Command and we're looking at our own doctrine was that Mission Command is not entirely new. This is not a new template. This is a natural, I think we use the words natural evolution and re-emphasis on the very doctrinal precepts that made us who we are. And so I think you identify, hey, there's lots of examples of Mission Command happening in the Air Force, and adopting the Mission Command principles now that we're putting words and a re-emphasis and an increase or an evolution onto what allows us airmen to be great. And so I think that's fantastic. And perhaps for any of the listeners, if you're executing Mission Command and it looks vastly different than anything you've ever done before, you may not be doing it correctly.
Yeah.
So that's excellent, sir.
I would applaud the LeMay Center for fleshing this out because, I mean, look, the situation that I just described, one with 9/11, I was at that point almost a 20-year officer. In AETC, I was a 38-year officer. I mean, I have a vast pool of experience to be able to fall back on. But if we're asking NCOs, even if it's mid-career NCOs, mid-career officers, to exercise commander's intent and understand it, a little bit of scrutiny, as you've done with the 5 C's and some of the other key principles, is really, really important. So I think LeMay is to be applauded for that.
It was certainly a group effort, and all of our processes send it out to the Air Force at large to make sure we get significant weigh-in and a lot of direction from HAF as well. So definitely a group effort, but appreciate the kudos. As we get to the end here, sir, I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity, again, leveraging your vast experience, thinking back, having been able to see the evolution of the Air Force through periods of big change, now in a big change again, to this new refocus, this retool. And as we go to Mission Command and try to give the thoughts officers, mid-career NCOs should have in their mind as they move towards this Mission Command culture. And I'll caveat that with saying that I like this kind of be the final word. So I'll thank you again for being here. This has been tremendous, and I know it's going to be super helpful to our force. So thank you for your time.
Oh, absolutely. My honor, my pleasure. I keep coming back to kind of the same thing, but you can tell I really believe it. The asymmetric advantage that the United States Air Force enjoys is a professionalized NCO Corps. And so often I get asked, do you have any regrets about, if you could change one thing? And honestly, I don't have that many regrets. And the more I was asked that question, I finally said, I was blessed in that I had a 6-man aircraft that I flew. It was 4 NCOs, 2 officers. Everyone is just a very sharp team. But the NCOs developed themselves. And they did a fine job by and large. But I think the officers, and I include myself in this, could have done a better job of mentoring our NCOs to be further down the road, more than just the best flight engineer, more than just the best aerial gunner, but to be future senior enlisted advisors in a joint environment, command chiefs in the Air Force. Some of them did. They did by and large of their own accord, because we, the officers, were focused on officer development. We were pretty good at that. But we tended to view the NCO Corps as technicians, which of course they are, very skilled technicians. But the NCO Corps can be and is more than that. They are really, really, really good at every leadership attribute that the officers are. Regardless of what audience I was in, I'd probably pass that on, because I think to keep feathering the nest of that asymmetric advantage for us will really help us in our journey on mission command, and to help us confront the challenges that we have from a national security perspective going forward.
That's going to do it for this week's podcast. The show is recorded, edited, and produced by the LeMay Center's Doctrine Outreach section. Special thanks to Lieutenant General Brad Webb, the LeMay Center, and Air University. As always, the views expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Air University, the Air Force, or any government agency. All Air Force operational doctrine is available at doctrine.af.mil, as well as links to tactical, support, joint, and sister service doctrine. I'm Nicholas Underwood. We will see you next time.